Okay, good evening and welcome to our seminar, Third World Seminar this evening, the Challenge from China, featuring Dr. Philip Smedra. I'll just say a few words first. I'm Dr. Harold Isaacs, Professor Emeritus of History here at Georgia Southwestern. And I started this series about 30 years ago. In fact, it is the 30th anniversary. And that's hard to believe. I was just thinking about it, because most people in here aren't 30. Now, my friends Kathy and Paul Zach, of course, are, and Dr. Smedra and myself, and Mr. Bob Slinker, I think, also qualifies there. And thank you, Bob, for taping it again. But the first seminar was February 18th, 1981, and it was in Roni 301. It was on major developments in Asia, Central America, and the Middle East. And I can name the people, but they probably wouldn't be familiar to you besides myself, and maybe I'm not familiar either. But that seminar grew, and we're still having, we must have about 140 seminars, I think. But from there we established the Association Third World Studies, which is the largest professional organization of its kind in the world. We've had, our 29th meeting will be in Salvador da Bahia, Brazil, November 20th to 23rd. And so if you're interested, go on the internet and just type in ATWS and you will get our website, which is fairly new, about a year and a half, 2 years old, but and you can read about that. And then we also publish a journal of Third World Studies. And in fact, Ms. Zach here is the production person for it. I'm the editor. Dr. Smedra is on the board of editors. So anyhow, we have a lot of things in Third World Studies here, probably more than any other place in the country. I just saw Dr. Tu come in. And hey, Dr. Tu, she's been a participant several times, and we appreciate her support. Well, you can find out more about that. Next year, we know of one seminar we're going to have, in at least one in the fall on the Peace Corps. And in fact, Dr. Smedra was in the Peace Corps, so he'll be part of that. Well, Dr. Smedra is an outstanding scholar and person. And I've known him about 10 years. And I believe he came here in 2001. But he is now professor of economics here at the university. I keep saying college. And he's just an outstanding scholar. He's got a tremendous background. Originally from New York, he went to Penn State University and got his BA. Then he went to University of Georgia and earned his MA and PhD degree in agricultural economics. Development economics. No, it was agricultural economics, but and he is an authority on development economics in small island states. And he was recognized just recently by last May, and was given the GSW Vice President's Award for Excellence in Scholarship. And that's a great achievement. Dr. Smedra has written a lot of papers. He's attended a lot of conferences. He's, as I say, on the board of editors, Journal of Third World Studies, also on the board of the Georgia Consortium Incorporated. And he was in the Peace Corps in Morocco. and he's taught all over the world, including China, where for the last 3 years he's visited, and just last year he taught at Ningbo University of Technology, and he's published numerous articles, and he's also taught at the University of South Pacific, Suva, Fiji Islands, and has done studies there on the health of people, diseases like diabetes and blood pressure and things like that. And so that's helped improve things there. And not only that, he is the director of our study abroad programs here. And just in a short span of time, he has established programs in China, Bulgaria, and Jamaica involving various departments of the university. And also works with, is going to have a house build with the Fuller Center in May in El Salvador. And so Dr. Smedra knows China, and he is, we're honored to have him once again. He's been here several times, and he's going to talk about the challenge from China, and then after, we want you to ask questions. You'll be the respondent, the audience. So thank you very much for your attendance and your support, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Smedra.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. Thanks to Dr. Isaacs for inviting me once again to talk. And I think that these seminars are really helpful and useful to students and faculty. It's nice to have faculty get up and talk about the things that they're working on and things that they know about, and also talk about their experiences in the developing world, and maybe kind of bring a bit of internationalism to the campus down here in Southwest Georgia, and we need as much as we can possibly get down here. Let me mention, since Dr. Isaacs mentioned study abroad, we are going to have a fuller build in Peru, actually, rather than El Salvador. Well, we changed it. It's changed. So if any of you are interested in, it's actually a course that's in the catalog called University 4000. If you're interested in participating, it's going to be during Maymester. It'll start here on campus for just a few days, and then probably about 10 days in Peru, in the region of Lima. And we're trying to find a bit of financing from the university and the foundation, GSW Foundation, which has financed University 4000 in the past. So if you're interested, please contact me. My office is over in the Business Administration building. Actually, I wanted to start on slide number 1. So let's just go to the previous thing. So I've been interested in China for, as long as I can remember. It's been a mystery and intriguing, and just from a population point of view. I mean, here's a country that is the most populous in the world by a great deal, and will continue to be until India catches up, which is going to be pretty soon, I think. And just the change that is that's come about in China over the past 30 years. Here's a poor agrarian country that has been transformed into a dynamic, industrialized powerhouse in a span of, 30 years ago is when the premier back then decided that the change was needed. But essentially over the past 20 years, since the beginning of the 1990s, this country has grown by leaps and bounds. Its average GDP growth, gross domestic product growth, over the past 15 years has been 10% a year. And if you compare that to US growth or any industrialized Western society's growth, we're happy if we have 2 to 3% growth in GDP every year. And it doesn't seem as though growth in China is going to stop anytime soon. So we can expect China last year in 2010 leaped over Japan to become the second biggest economy in the world. US, now China, Japan, and then Germany. And people are predicting conservatively that by the year 2030, 20 years from now, that China will be number one, the United States will be number two. I think, and a lot of other economists, development economists, think that it's going to happen much sooner than that, probably in the next 10 years. By 2020, China will be the number one economy in the world. This is a picture of, if you don't recognize it, Hong Kong, which became part of China, well, of course was part of China until the British decided that they wanted to take this over, and then reverted back to Chinese control in 1999. And many economists back then, 12 years ago, thought that, even 12 years ago, the powerhouse that China has become didn't exist in the minds of a lot of Western economists. We thought that the Chinese system, as it existed back 12 and 14 years ago, would ruin Hong Kong, this bastion of capitalism, this financial capital of Asia, that the Chinese system would ruin Hong Kong. But lo and behold, what's happened is that this system that Hong Kong has practiced very successfully for many, many years has been adopted in many other parts of China. And so we have Shanghai and Beijing, and that look essentially, of course you don't have the South China Sea down here in Shanghai and Beijing, but they look essentially like this. And so you've got a country that's adopted capitalism with all of its bells and whistles and is charging along faster than any other economy in the world. And that's something to admire. And again, I have been interested in China, and I always wanted to go, and had my first opportunity to go in 2008, just 3 years ago, when my wife, executive MBA program, the 40 people that were involved in that, took a trip to China, and I went along as a spouse. And so we traveled through Shanghai and Beijing and Nanjing and a small city, 2 million people, called Bengbu, which is in the region of Nanjing. And I was flabbergasted. Of course, Shanghai is something to see. But all these other cities, many cities that you've never heard of. I'll talk about Ningbo, where I was last year, a city of 6 million people, in the Shanghai region, about 120 miles south of Shanghai. That is immense. It's huge. There are skyscrapers everywhere. We don't have an appreciation for the power of this country. And because we don't, many of us underestimate what China is going to be in just a few years, and where we're going to be in relation to China in just a few years. So that's kind of what I want to talk about. The dynamic of the Chinese economy, and where we're falling down in the US by not addressing the challenge that China is confronting us with. 100 years ago, Theodore Roosevelt said that our future history will be more determined by our position on the Pacific facing China than by our position on the Atlantic facing Europe. This was before World War I, it was before World War II. Our focus, the US focus, was toward Europe. China was this medieval kingdom that many of us didn't really appreciate. But apparently Theodore Roosevelt began thinking about China and possibly the challenges that it posed back more than 100 years ago. So this American concern or admiration or envy of China has been around for a while. Not that Theodore Roosevelt envied the Chinese, but knew that probably the future would be determined by our interactions with the East rather than our interactions with the West. So China has been, as you know, driving global economic trends for a number of years, at least the last 10 years. It's increased globally the demand for metals and minerals and fuels, and of course is one of the contributing factors for pushing prices of all these basic industrial commodities high. It's one of the, along with India, one of these, again, industrial powerhouses that is pushing the demand for these materials up, and therefore causing prices of those basic materials to increase. This is a photo of, for those of you who are not Chinese, Shanghai. And this is the terminus of the Maglev train. Maglev, magnetic levitation. This is actually German technology, but it's the only, as far as I know, it's the only placement of a maglev train anywhere in the world. So the technology is German, but the Chinese have decided to, well, have already built only about 15 kilometers from the airport in Shanghai out to this point. This is the terminus. And when you come into Shanghai, you get on this train that goes magnetic levitation, meaning it doesn't have any wheels. There's a concrete channel, and this train sits between those concrete channels and hovers because of magnetic power. And when I was in it with my wife and the other MBA people, there's a digital speedometer in every car, and we get up to 450 kilometers an hour, which is 230, 240 miles an hour. I've been on the TGV in France and the other fast trains in Europe, and this thing, if it was tilted a little bit, we could have gone into orbit. The speed was so great. It's really something to experience. And every time you come into Shanghai, and from what my perception was, everybody has to get on this train because you can't get a taxi at the Shanghai airport. You have to get on the train and come out to the terminus here, and then you pick up a taxi. In any case, that's what we did. And my thinking is it's a demonstration of Chinese will to be at the forefront of, in this case, transportation technology. And it's tremendously impressive. Anybody who rides this train thinks that this probably is the future. So, biggest consumer of aluminum, steel, copper, coal, second biggest oil consumer after us. 1/3 of the increase in global oil demand since 2000. Last year, it surpassed us as being the biggest carbon emitter in the world, which is something that we and China have to sit down and talk about because the future is going to be pretty dim if, in fact, everything kind of heats up because of the coal that both us and the Chinese are burning. China is an export-oriented economy. 36% of its GDP is based on exports. And that's increasing. By comparison, in the United States, about 12% of our gross domestic product is considered to be exports. And part of that is people coming to foreigners coming to the United States and staying in hotels. The entire tourist industry in the US is considered to be an export. So in real terms, we are producing much, much fewer exports than 12% of our GDP. China focuses on being an export economy. And the US is the biggest country that it exports to. It's second behind the European Union, but again, that's made up of 27 different countries, but the US is the biggest export market. More than simply being an exporter, domestic demand in China is also increasing, which is something that the Chinese government wants very earnestly to cultivate domestic consumption and not rely on the world market to sell its exports. And that's happening. There are large increases in domestic consumption. And this is difficult to do in an economy that is made up of consumers that are essentially savers. In the United States, we're consumers. We spend. In some years, our savings is actually negative. The average credit card debt in the United States, take all the credit cards that are out there, divide it into the debt, and the average credit card debt in the US is about $6,000 on every card. In China and in Asia in general, these people are savers. The average income saved in China and Japan and in Taiwan is about 30% of income. And the Chinese government, the Japanese government over the past few years has attempted to promote domestic consumption. And the reason for that is not to rely on export markets. When China entered the global economy and workers in factories contributing to the export economy of China, what that did was increase, as this says, the potential growth rate of the world economy. It caused low inflation because Chinese laborers used to be very, very cheap. More recently, There have been companies that have left China because of minimum wage legislation that's been passed, and have moved to other countries that don't have that minimum wage legislation, like Vietnam and Bangladesh. And so China, the government of China is a bit worried that labor, which is the driver of Chinese export economy, China has a comparative advantage in most industries because of its cheap labor. But as that labor becomes more expensive, as the economy becomes wealthier, China's going to have to rely on other means to enhance its comparative advantage in order to remain this big power in the global market. So with this introduction 20 years ago of Chinese labor into the global economy, and also Indian labor, this ratio, and forgive me for using some economic terms here, ratio of capital to labor has fallen by half, and what that means is that in the United States, people who don't have decent educations, people who have dropped out of high school, or even if they have a high school education, and who used to work in manufacturing, no longer can find jobs because all those jobs have left to go originally down to Mexico and now over to China and in the future to Vietnam. And so if you look at the unemployment rate in the United States, which now is hovering around 9%, if you look at people in different stratums of education, the people with fewer levels of education, the people that dropped out of high school or people with just a high school degree, their unemployment rate is closer to 20%. People with a higher degree, people who've started college or have an associate or a four-year degree, their unemployment rate is much lower than the national average, more about 5% or 6%. And that's gotten worse because of this entrance of Chinese labor into the global labor market. So what's happened is, this third point, the bargaining power of workers in developed countries has diminished. You know, if workers don't want to work for what employers are offering in the United States, then they're not going to be working. And union power in the United States is pretty limited in most industries. In the private sector, the percentage of the labor force that's represented by unions is only about 6%. It's much higher in the public sector, and we've heard a lot about public sector unions and what's happening in Wisconsin and in other states. But in the private sector, unions don't have a great deal of power. So if you're looking for work in the private sector, probably there's not going to be all that much. And if there is, the wage that you're going to get is going to be dictated by the employer because of this diminished power that employees have. So, having said all that, and this diminished power of employees, corporate profits as a percent of gross domestic product are close to record levels, have been very close to, record levels. And one of the reasons for that is Chinese entry in the global labor market, and it has caused a depression of wages throughout the entire Western industrialized world, which, if you think hard about that, it's good for us because it keeps goods in this country much cheaper than they would be if, in fact, those goods were manufactured here in this country. Of course, it's bad for people who can't find work. So, Western capitalists can thank the emergence of the world's biggest communist country for their record profits. How ironic. But you've got to, you have to take this adjective, communist, with a grain of salt. The Chinese haven't been communist in 30 years. And you don't hear people talking about China in those terms any longer. You hear about the People's Republic of China. Not so much communist China, unless you're listening to like Rush Limbaugh. Or some of these other right-wing radio personalities. So back 30 years ago, when this is Deng Xiaoping, he was the Mikhail Gorbachev of China. Gorbachev was the Russian prime minister or president, whatever, who kind of oversaw the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And Deng Xiaoping looked at what communism was doing to China between 1949 and 1978. And he decided that this system, this communist system, simply wasn't working for the people of China. It wasn't providing them with the food and with the basic social structure that they needed in order to advance. It wasn't elevating the social welfare. So what he did was institute something called socialism with Chinese characteristics, which really has morphed into capitalism with American characteristics. And capitalism, what I call and what I tell my classes, Wild West capitalism, because there are essentially no holds barred. There are laws that regulate, just like we have laws that regulate the environmental quality and antitrust, but there is no enforcement where there is enforcement here in the United States. So we have a Wild West capitalism, which has caused this country, China, to pull 400 million people out of abject poverty into a middle class. That's the power of the market. And for those of you who are my students, I won't get into that entire argument. But if you have problems with capitalism, just look at China and look at India. And India has done it in a shorter period of time. They decided to change their system in 1991. And now they've become an Asian tiger and are becoming richer by the moment, as are the Chinese. So, not really socialism with a Chinese face. Essentially, American capitalism with kind of Wild West characteristics. So, what China has done in global commodity markets has pushed up prices. But also what it's done is cause the goods that they produce and export to be much cheaper than they would be if, in fact, we in the United States relied on American goods. So, yes, they've increased commodity prices by their increased demand for these raw materials, but in producing this output and selling that output in foreign markets, they've kept the rate of inflation very low in the West. So we can thank the Chinese system for that, for the prices that we pay, and that inflation isn't any higher than it has been over the past 10 or 15 years. Buying U.S. debt. And I'll kind of talk about this and how it relates to currency for a few minutes. China, and this figure was just revised yesterday, as a matter of fact. It had been reported that China held about $800 billion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds, and Japan about $700 billion. But the news yesterday was there's been a reevaluation, and now the true number is $1.2 trillion of U.S. debt. Total U.S. debt currently is it's hovering at about $14 trillion. So China, give or take, owns about 10% of our debt. And there are good reasons for doing that. The best reason is that it keeps the dollar value high relative to the Chinese renminbi, the Chinese currency. And another reason is U.S. Treasury bonds currently pay 3.4%. So if you're sitting on $1.2 trillion of this, you're getting about $40 billion of interest every year. So that's a good thing for the Chinese Treasury. But essentially, the government of China buys U.S. debt in order to attempt to manipulate the currency. And the reason why they do that is because it keeps Chinese goods relatively cheap in Western markets. Or, again, if it's buying American debt, it keeps Chinese goods relatively cheap in American markets. So, by buying debt, what that did was keep interest rates in the United States relatively low. If China wasn't buying our debt, then the U.S. government would have to rely on domestic financial markets to borrow money. All governments borrow money. Nobody can collect as much taxes as they need to pay their expenses. So all governments borrow money. If in fact the Chinese weren't buying that much debt, the American government, the American Treasury would go into our domestic market for loanable funds, and the terminology is crowd out private investors. They would suck up so much liquidity in that market that interest rates would be driven up, and the private sector in the U.S. economy would be paying, or would have to pay, much higher interest rates on the money that they borrowed. That's called the crowding out effect. Government coming into a loanable funds market and soaking up so much money, so much liquidity that everybody else has to pay a higher price, a higher interest rate. So that's not happened because the Chinese are buying our debt. And that's a good thing. I'm here to tell you that that's a good thing. And we don't have to be concerned about our grandchildren having to pay back this debt. Because, when I was an undergrad, which is a few years ago now, I was an econ major, and we talked about debt. Of course, the debt was a lot lower back then. And there were people that were against our increasing our debt limit, just like there are people in Congress right now that are against increasing our debt limit. And the reason that they gave was, well, what we're doing is shuffling off this debt to our grandchildren. Well, you folks are our grandchildren. And how are you feeling that impact? You're not. What you're doing is consuming like every other American is consuming. You're not even paying higher interest rates because the Chinese are buying our US debt. So this entire argument about we don't want to saddle our future generations with insurmountable debt is a straw man. It's ridiculous. It's a stupid argument. And anybody who uses that argument, and a lot of people in Congress do, doesn't really know anything about economics. A lot of people don't know anything about economics. So if you're not an econ student, I recommend if you're a student here at GSW, take an econ course before you leave. It's kind of grounding for the real world. So one of the things that this did was, the Chinese buying our debt, was to keep interest rates low all over the Western world. And what that did was contribute to this liquidity bubble, low mortgage rates, low automobile loan rates, low student loan rates. More people went to school, which is a good thing. Lots of people bought houses that they couldn't afford, which is not a good thing. And as you know, as all bubbles have to do, the bubble burst. So, but the point is that China's global impact over the past 10 years has been immense. It's been huge. It has essentially checked global inflation. It's kept interest rates low. It's kept bond yields relatively low, and which is good for the people that are borrowing money. House prices, wages, profits, commodity prices are being driven by decisions that are made in China. The most profound economic change in the world over the past 50 years. And it truly is. I can't think of anything, and I've been around for a long time. I've been out of school for like 40 years, undergrad school for 40 years. And this is true. There's no other economic change in the world that compares to what is happening in China and the impact that China has had on the global economy. Let's talk about the currency a bit. This is another thing that people in Congress complain about. People who don't have a lot of information just think that, yes, they're buying our debt because they want to keep their goods cheap in the United States, which is bad for the United States because it takes jobs away from the United States. You've heard that argument over and over and over again. It's true that the principal reason why China, the government of China, buys U.S. debt is to keep the dollar relatively high relative to the Chinese currency. Again, to make Chinese goods less expensive in American markets. But it's much more than cheap currency that makes Chinese goods attractive, much more. And it's much more than cheap currency that has created this engine of economic growth. That is, in fact, China. China has a comparative advantage in the manufacture of essentially everything. Think about what we manufacture here in the United States any longer. We don't do cheap stuff anymore because we can't afford it. China can afford it. They have a comparative advantage because they continue to have cheap labor. But besides cheap labor, they have, as this says, a tremendous infrastructure. I just showed you a picture of the Maglev Train. Not all of China is crisscrossed by the Maglev Train, as far as I know. It's just that piece, that 15-kilometer piece from the Shanghai airport. But the road construction, the port construction, the superhighway construction continues, and it's making China one of the most modern infrastructure countries in the world. And that just benefits economic growth. Hospitality to business. The Chinese government wants people to site in China and will provide them with tax benefits and all kinds of other incentives to bring your business to China. Compliant unions, well, unions not really in the sense of the term that we know unions. There isn't a great deal of collective bargaining going on in China. But those folks who are organized are compliant. And probably most important, a hardworking labor force who takes their work seriously, very, very seriously. And it's really something to see. You know, we visited factories, my first visit with my wife's group, and these are people who, you know, don't hang around the water cooler most of the time. They're busy working and earning money and providing a better future for their children. And they are in fact doing exactly that, providing a better future for their children. So, Chinese companies make goods for less than 25% of what their manufacture would cost in the United States. So about a quarter of what, you know, just pick something that you've bought at Walmart or at the, what's it called, a Harbor Freight, you know, a hardware store, and that same good would cost about 4 times what it costs to produce in China. Okay, so a lot of economists, a lot of monetary economists think that if China didn't attempt to manipulate its currency, if it allowed its currency to float, which most Western industrialized countries do, the dollar floats, meaning the value of the dollar is determined by supply and demand. You know, the euro floats, the Swiss franc floats, the British pound floats, the Japanese yen floats. The Chinese renminbi doesn't float, it's controlled. If in fact the government of China allowed it to float, then most monetary economists think that it would appreciate by 20%. The value of that currency would appreciate by 20% relative to the dollar. But I just said that Chinese manufacturers can produce goods for about 1/4 the cost of what it costs to produce in the United States. So even if, you know, people in Congress got really upset and decided to establish some kind of punitive measures to force the Chinese government to allow its currency to float, that's not going to help our exports. Not at all. It won't even come close. If in fact labor costs increase or the renminbi increased in value, what's going to happen, and what's already happening, is manufacturers are leaving China because now labor has become a little bit more expensive. And, you know, all those shirts and all those pants, what does it take to pack up a garment factory? You know, pack the sewing machines up and put them in a shipping container, and bang, you're in Hanoi essentially overnight. And that's what's happened. So, and that's what would happen if in fact that currency was allowed to float. Business would go to Vietnam, to India, to Bangladesh. And so rather than all these goods being sourced in China, we'd go to Walmart, and all those goods would be sourced in Vietnam or India or Bangladesh. So forcing the Chinese government to allow its currency to float is not going to help our export-oriented industries. 2005 to 2008, this is a picture I took. Some of the others are, you know, off the internet, but some of the photos that I'm showing you are mine. And this is a Starbucks, in the best Starbucks I've ever visited in my life. This is in Center City, Ningbo, and it's 3 tiers. So you come in, and there's, you know, the first floor, and then there's a second floor, and then there's a third floor, and I got a big kick out of this place. And strangely enough, the coffee is as expensive as it is in the United States, which you'd think, you know, this is a developing country. I ought to be able to get a mocha latte for like a quarter of what it costs here in the United States. But unfortunately, no. And the place was packed, which kind of indicates this power of the middle class in China. So the Chinese government from 2005 to 2008 allowed its currency to rise by 21%. Because of pressure from Western industrialized countries. And that didn't cause our exports to increase at all. So we have other problems besides the Chinese manipulating their currency. Problems that we should probably be focusing on. So at the beginning of our recession that lasted for about 18 months, exports from China slowed. But not as much as other countries' exports slowed. And there are other countries that manipulate their currencies, not just China. Taiwan manipulates the value of its currency. Singapore does. But even with those other countries not allowing their currencies to rise, Chinese exports have done better than these other currencies that continue to keep their currencies at a fixed value relative to the dollar. So the point is, it's not currency, the currency valuation between the dollar and the renminbi that is causing pain to the American economy. Here's an example, and unfortunately we don't learn from history in lots of things, in many, many things. During the 1980s, when the Japanese, especially the Japanese automobile companies, began importing very heavily into the United States, we wanted, the US government 30 years ago pressured the Japanese to allow the yen to rise. And it did, as this indicates, by 50%. And that didn't do anything to enhance US exports to the global market. This is another photo of Center City, Ningbo, a big pedestrian shopping region. That first store there is a Cartier and a Zara, which is a European women's fashion store. So there's a great deal of money in this particular town. So the dollar has fallen in value by 23% as a combination of strengthening sometimes of the dollar and then falling back, but by pressure from the United States to the Chinese government to allow that the currency to float a bit, float within a range that the Chinese government is comfortable with. And that, again, it hasn't helped our export economy at all. It hasn't helped the countries that rely on, or the companies, sorry, that rely on exports. This is our problem. We're consumers, and we don't invest much. We just like to spend. And that's important for our economy. Consumption is 70% of our gross domestic product. It's super, super important. But unfortunately, when we focus all our energies and all our resources on consumption, there isn't a great deal left over for investment, which is what the Chinese have been focusing on. Investment, infrastructure. And now they're focusing on another aspect of this problem that we are moving back from, retreating from, and that's education. So it's more than simply currency manipulation that's going on. China's moving up the value chain. Rather than simply relying on exportation of cheap goods, the country is developing industry and jobs that were once our prerogative of Western industrialized countries. All that cheap stuff that was coming in from China now is left or is leaving for these cheaper labor countries. And so the Chinese government now has focused its resources, and that's one of the advantages of being what's called an authoritarian capitalist economy. That is, rather than the market relying on all the decisions that are required for resource allocation, you've got a government that's deciding where to put the resources that are available. It's capitalism, but you've got an authority there that's making sure that those resources are directed toward the sectors of the economy that will grow the economy the most. So moving up the value chain, China's not going to be continuing to flood our market with cheap goods. And this is the most significant, as this point indicates, the most significant challenge that the U.S. faces in the future. We have a comparative advantage. It's no longer in electronics or textiles or the garment industry or any of those things, because they're more cheaply made in China or in Vietnam or in Singapore. But what we do have a comparative advantage in is the service industries, things like management and business consulting, financial services. And as China becomes better educated and as Chinese students learn English, then they are going to be competing in the in the industries that we have, as that last slide indicates, that we have a prerogative in. We think we have a prerogative in. Now that's pretty scary if you're an American, especially if you're an American that's 20 years old. Because where are you folks going to work? Because those jobs are, if the low education jobs have left, now we're talking about jobs that require a college education. They're going. And they'll be going at a faster rate. So you're going to have to be much more creative in attempting to find work in the next 5 or 10 years. Soon, not sometime 30 years from now. This is Ningbo Department Store number 2 in downtown Ningbo. So China has focused on building its physical infrastructure. It didn't need to invest in human capital because its comparative advantage was cheap labor. So human capital, education. It didn't need to because it was taking all these jobs from all the industrialized countries and producing goods that could be produced with cheap labor. Now those jobs are leaving. And so the Chinese government is focusing on developing human capital, focusing on education. Here's Chairman Mao. So the government focused on infrastructure, and everything had to be modern and efficient, and that's the way you develop a comparative advantage. And that's exactly how China developed this foundation, and now it's going to build on that foundation. And then this is, in fact, the challenge from China. What China did was build all those things with a speed that has never been seen in human history, recorded human history. This is a photo of downtown Ningbo. They're building a metro system, an underground metro system through the city. So the objective now for the Chinese government is higher quality goods and services. And that's the services part is what should make Americans sit up and take notice. Because that, again, is where we have a comparative advantage. And when the Chinese begin to push our dominance in exportable services, then we're going to have to find something else to do in this country. Since 1998, China's tripled its share of GDP devoted to education. Think about this relative to what we've been doing here in the United States, relative to what we've been doing here in the state of Georgia, and cutting of Hope scholarships, which was a great thing that Zell Miller did back in, I think, 1998, something like that. And now those things are going away. We can't afford it. That's ridiculous. Cut something else. Don't cut your future. Your future is the individuals that are attempting to build on their human capital. The number of universities has doubled in the past 10 years, and the number of students at university has quintupled in 10 years. 5 times the number of students, and double the number of universities. And I've been fortunate enough to visit some of these places, and they're big, and they're new, and they have all the technology. They're all wired. And there are thousands and thousands of students at all of these brand new places. And those are the people that you folks are going to be competing with. Well, that first point is the one I just made, and that hurts. Anybody who's involved in education knows that when you cut funding toward a university system, that what you're doing is you're trying to balance the budget, but you're cutting your nose off to spite your face. You're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And forgive the metaphors, the poor metaphors. But we're slashing budgets. China is building universities at a pace that has never been seen in the world. The largest system of higher education in the world in 10 years, and it continues to build. The economic impact of trained workers. Somebody with a high school education is about twice as productive as somebody who drops out of school in the 9th grade. Somebody with a college education, 3 times more productive. And so the more and more individuals go to college, the more productive they are, and the more productive the country becomes. And also the standard of living increases. That's what wages are geared to. is productivity. So the more productive you are, the more you can expect to earn. And our productivity has kind of, gone up incrementally, but the productivity in China is about to explode. China lags in services, but what they're doing is they're building this foundation in order to be competitive in providing services, management services and business services, these things that have been exported principally to India because Indians are English speakers. But now there's going to be a cohort of Chinese graduates that are going to be good English speakers and will probably be earning a salary that is at least as competitive as these individuals in India. So we're going to be competing with two countries that have English capabilities and can do the work for a salary much cheaper than what we expect here in the United States. As students learn English, train in technology, Chinese firms will enter the vast market for services. And this is going to boost Chinese GDP growth for a generation, for the next 20 years. And here's this estimate of 2030, China becoming the richest country in the world by gross domestic product. But my own prediction, and lots of other people think that it's going to happen much sooner, probably 10 years sooner than this, by 2020. So it's not the result of currency manipulation or hidden subsidies, the things that you hear about from Congress, and the things that you hear Congress people complaining about. We have to do something. We have to build tariffs. Last year President Obama imposed a tariff on tires that are imported into the United States from China, on tires, to protect the domestic tire industry. That's not the way to go here. The way to go is strategic investment, as this points out, and hard work. And the question remains whether we in fact can do this. Can we work hard? Can we work as hard as the Chinese? I don't know whether we can. We're a consumption society. We're kind of, our ideal is taking a cruise someplace and just sitting around and eating for a week. People in China don't take cruises. They work. And again, I don't know whether we can capture this. I don't know whether we can, harness this pioneering effort. There's a reason why we became the richest country in the world, because we had this once. I don't know whether we have it anymore. So the basic thing that we can do is to make the U.S. economy more dynamic and American workers more competitive. That's easy to say. How do we actually do that? And kind of catch up to the speed at which China is progressing. And just a couple things about, just a little bit about politics, not too much, because I'm not a political scientist and I don't really study politics. But the U.S. and China have to cooperate because, as I mentioned, we're number one and number two in carbon emissions. So if we're concerned about the welfare of the planet 100 years from now, then we're going to have to sit down and talk about limiting carbon emissions and lots of other things, nuclear proliferation, financial problems, making sure that the world economy doesn't melt down like it almost did 3 years ago. The China that we see, most people see when we visit China or Chinese students come here to the United States, is a peaceful China, one that supports a conservative approach to international relations. I think that would be a good way to describe how we interact currently. But there's also a very strong nationalistic streak in China, just like there is all over the world. We have a strong nationalistic streak here in the United States. But the Chinese are an economy, a country that's attempting to rise from abject poverty, whereas we've been rich for a long, long time. And so maybe the feelings in China are a bit more pronounced than they are here in the United States. Some people think that we, or the West, the United States or the West, wants to block China's rise, especially wants to block them from becoming the biggest economy in the world. I personally don't think that that's the case. I think that we can all get along as long as we focus, and this is not going to be because China wants us to, or allows us to, but it's something that we're going to have to find in our national psyche. This notion of devoting resources to those sectors that are going to help us compete. And that, one of those sectors is education. Why should ideological rivals be friends? And, I don't know whether we're ideological rivals anymore. Well, for these reasons, and then I'll talk about why I don't think we're ideological rivals. Economic benefits, global epidemics, these things, many times start in Asia. But the second point here, are the US and China ideological rivals? Oh, they were 30 years ago, absolutely. But now, we're both capitalist market sort of economies. And so ideology is not all that important any longer. There is a part of Chinese culture that does contrast with our culture. Samuel Huntington, for those of you in, I don't know where you'd be introduced to Huntington, political science maybe. Clash of civilizations. And he described a world where ideologies weren't important any longer. Communism, socialism, capitalism, some other isms. But what's going to be important and what's going to cause civilizations to clash is religious and cultural identities. And currently there are these differences. We're a market capitalist society, and China is an emerging capitalist society, but also it's a Confucian culture, which considers humanity and self-awareness and self-growth, ritual and filial piety. That contrasts with individuals in a capitalist society. Adam Smith talked about capitalism and said that when everybody works to their own advantage, when everybody is selfish, in other words, that's best for society. And Chinese society currently, as an observer of China, is not quite there yet. So there may be this clash between this Confucian culture and our own market capitalist culture. But the last point, but only short term, because what's happening is, how are we doing? Okay. What's happening is, you've got an emerging middle class in China. And as that middle class emerges, China's politics will change. And China's notion of what's important will change, which I'm not saying is a good thing. I think this notion of self-awareness and filial piety, I think that's a good thing. But it's inevitable as China becomes more and more capitalist, that it in fact takes on this notion of doing the best for yourself and your family and the heck with everybody else, which is totally against Confucianism. And again, as China becomes richer, people in rich countries typically enjoy higher levels of political rights and civil liberties. That's bound to happen. I don't know when. Nobody knows when. But the system will, in fact, change. It must. We thought it was going to change in 1989 with the student revolt in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. But it didn't. But it's still in the psyche of many middle-aged people now that there is this notion of self-expression that needs to be released. When wealth is spread more evenly, China's view of the world will change. Wealth implies global responsibility. And it implies, again, a change from this humanist notion of self-worth. Responsibility means seeking stability in domestic affairs and international relations. We're already seeing that. Chinese government now realizes that it's emerging as this power in the world, whereas Soviet Union was this power. We had a bipolar globe 20 years ago, and since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we've been unipolar. The United States has been the big power. But now China realizes that it now is, or will be, almost as powerful as China. And it has been acting very, very responsibly, being involved in decisions about climate change, or talking about climate change and nuclear disarmament. And so even though there's a bit of populism among Chinese leadership, populism meaning pandering to the masses, Stability in China is important to the Chinese government. A strong China, militarily strong China, is maybe a concern for the United States, but the U.S. spends about 10 times as much on its military as China does right now. The U.S. spends more than all the other countries in the world combined on its military. So we really don't have to worry too much about a strong military China right now. But also we don't want a weak China because instability in Asia is something that we're not happy about. Instability in any part of the world. We're looking at North Africa and the Middle East right now, and that gives us heartburn. So what we want is stability. And the question becomes whether the United States, getting back to the economic part of this, can grasp the challenge that's facing us, or whether we're going to be like these, I think these are Iowa farmers. I'm not quite sure what Grant Wood was painting here when he painted American Gothic. But we can't be deer in the headlights, which is what these folks look like. Although she's looking at him, but he's looking at headlights. And when you're looking at the headlights, you can't see anything else. And unfortunately, I think that the U.S. currently, based on the actions of Congress and based on the actions of state legislatures all around the United States, we're deers in headlights. We can't see what's ahead of us. And so that needs to change. We have the largest economy. We have the biggest military by far. We have technology companies that are beacons to the world. And in order to continue to have that comparative advantage in those kinds of industries, then things need to change. What we are today is the result of decisions that were made during the 1950s and the 1960s. We have an interstate highway system that was constructed during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. We put a man on the moon. You recall this. I was in college at the time. In 1969. 40-something years ago. And we haven't done much with that. You know, we send these shuttles back and forth, which is a nice thing for the people that are riding them, but it doesn't do me a whole lot of good, and neither does it do you a whole lot of good. We thought back in 1969 that we would be in Mars by now, and some other place. And if there's a university in Mars, I volunteer to go. Linda Lee, are you listening? Good, thanks. I would like to be at the Mars State University and teach economics up there. So we back then invested in public education. We built the best system in the world. There's a reason why students come to the United States, especially do graduate level education. We had generous immigration policies. Rather than building walls, we invited immigrants to come, and we benefited from that. We became a multicultural society, and we've become rich because of these decisions that were made 40 and 50 years ago. And we've been stagnant since. Where are we? And I put this photo in here because it demonstrates, you know, these are attractive young individuals having fun. And I think one of the problems with our society, not to be a commentator on the problems with American society, is that we're too much fun. These folks don't need to be smiling as much. They need to be studying a little bit more, I think. So, 17th and 25th in math. We used to be number 1 in college graduation rates. Now we're 12th. We're 27th in life expectancy, in spite of the fact that we spend more money on healthcare in the United States than anybody else in the world, per capita and gross, total. And we're 27th in the world in life expectancy. There's got to be a reason for that. 18th in diabetes incidence, number 1 in obesity, and I don't need to get into that too much. So, you know, my conclusion here is that we're not ready for what we need to do in order to confront the challenge from China and the challenge from India, the challenge from these Asian tigers that are creeping up on our dominance in the world economy. I don't need to, I've already talked about what's happening in Congress, cutting all these ways in which we could guarantee that our economy would be as strong in the future as it has been in the past. we're just cutting money, just willy-nilly, just in order to balance a budget that doesn't need to be, and I'm here as an economist to tell you that it doesn't need to be balanced. There's no reason to balance the budget. As long as people continue to buy our debt, and the Chinese are very happy to buy our debt, so are all the other financial institutions in the world, so are your grandparents. I have an extra $10,000, which is what a T-bill, a treasury bond goes for. It's a good investment, by the way. Next time you talk to your grandparents, you might want to tell them you get 3.4% on $10,000, which is the minimum denomination. So that's one good thing you take from this seminar. And your grandparents will be very impressed, I'm sure. So these cuts aren't going to provide much in savings. We're talking about a few $1 billion, which, sounds like a lot, but really isn't when the total debt of the United States is $14 trillion. And our budget deficit this year is $1.3 trillion. So cut a few billion here and a few billion there. What you're doing is gutting an educational system that can't afford to be gutted any longer. And gutting support to the arts, support to science, cutting support to NASA. And then where do you see yourself as a country 10 years from now? What we're doing is cutting investments and subsidizing consumption, which is exactly the opposite of what the Chinese are doing, what the Indians are doing. We need to confront that, and we need to do something about it. We need to put people in Congress that realize the importance of education and of reconstructing an infrastructure that's crumbling, and borrowing money in order to be able to do that, and not worrying about balancing the budget, for goodness sakes. So China and these other countries are making these investments, and we are not. That's Shanghai by night, I think. So the next 10 years will determine how the 21st century will play out, both economically, politically. The next 10 years are going to be tremendously interesting. The last 10 years have been tremendously interesting. The last 30 years have been very, very interesting. But the next 10, when we are on the cusp of becoming number 2 in the world, that doesn't ring all that well with our American exceptionalism. We think that we're exceptional in the world. We've got this system, this democratic system that provides for a standard of living that's higher than anybody else in the world. And the reason for that is because of these investments that we made 40 and 50 years ago, and we're not willing to do that now, which bodes very poorly for where we're going to be 10 years from now. So, maybe this century will be China's century. The 20th century probably was our century, especially after World War II. This next century may be China's. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks. And and you folks you're the respondents. And so if you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Or you can question each other if you want. We have lots of students here from China, and they could give you firsthand account of the growth in that country and how rich they're going to be when they go back, and with the ability to speak English and all that. Are there any questions at all?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I see a number of transcripts, and I see what courses you all bring in. Your math is exceptional. Math is my area, so I'm always impressed by that. Why are you so much better in math? Practice. Okay, tell me about your math.
Something like, well, what you learn now, we learn something like in our junior high school, senior high school, everything, college algebra, especially in college algebra, we learn in the junior high school, 90%.
You hear that, everybody? They learned 90% of college algebra when they were in junior high.
I thought you folks actually started calculus in 3rd grade. No? That's just a myth. No, okay. Yeah, well, I think that's the answer. I mean, they start a lot earlier than we do.
The other thing that impresses me, everybody from the United States too, is that these students not only learn this early, but they retain it. So when they go into their computer science classes, into discrete structures, for example, they already know it because they've retained it. And I think that's one of the things we don't do in the United States is we forget. And probably it's because of practice. They continue practicing. They take education more seriously. And their parents make sure they take education more seriously.
Right. And Chinese American mothers are kind of practicing that in the United States. That's been the big thing over the past couple of months.
Some of the rest of us are too.
Okay, right.
Some of us grandmothers.
Yes, absolutely.
I have a quick question for the Chinese students. How many of you would like to stay in the United States after your college education and coming back? But how many of you would like to stay in the United States? How many of you would like to go back to China? Like, just take a hand of how many people who would like to stay in the United States just for...
Forever or just graduate school?
Huh?
Just graduate school or forever?
Or for
A long time.
live here permanently,
Yeah.
actually. I'm just curious. I mean, like, how many of you would like to live here permanently?
Can I give you
Yeah.
my answer? I think it depends on the U.S. economy.
Okay, it's up to you.
We say the same thing.
Yeah. We can go yourself.
We just heard that the economy of China is going to be on the upswing, and the economy of the United States is probably going to be. So they're all going back, in other words.
Yeah, and that depends on how we're gonna do in the next 10 years.
Right.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Other questions?
I want to ask the professor here, because you all had the Chinese student before. What do you think is the biggest difference between the Chinese students and the American students?
I mean, I have a very simple answer, but well, the difference is the seriousness with which Chinese students take their studies. I mean, I think everybody would agree. I mean, I have to coax my students to make sure that they crack a book before they take an exam. I'm exaggerating a little bit here. But I think that Chinese students realize, especially the ones that are, foreign students that come to the United States, they realize that that this is very serious, and they take their studies very seriously, and that's probably the difference. College for American undergrads is kind of a time to realize who you are and experience everything that college has to offer. But I think Chinese students realize that university is for studying, and once in a while you dress up for Chinese New Year's and stuff, but pretty much studying. And I think that's the big difference. I think my colleagues would probably agree. Yeah.
I just want to correct one a very small mistake you made.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Actually, Hong Kong went back to China 1997, and Macau went back to China 1999.
Okay,
So
good, thank you. I thought it was 1999.
Yeah, it's Macau.
Okay, good, thanks. If that was the extent of my mistakes, then, I'm happy. I'm happy. Anything else? Yes?
I have a question for the Chinese students. How do you guys balance your studies and your social life? And another thing is how do you make education such a way of life? Because I realize that you guys are making it a way of life, which is something that I'm doing when I'm in school. Like I'm sure that you guys are always constantly refreshing your mind. So how do you guys do that, especially as students? Even though you guys probably were raised that way, how do you guys do that as young students?
Especially in our environment, especially here.
I can see if I can address it. I came here when I was little, and again, I'm from Vietnam, so that's what part of what he was discussing. And I'm kind of like a lot of the Chinese students, all focused. There's no such thing as football. There's no such thing as all the extracurricular activity. So when you're raised, I mean, education is the number one focus. That means that, and I don't know about China, but when you have a class, and let's just say 50 students, you go home each month and you have a report card, they're rating you from 1 to 50. So if I go home and I'm ranked, I never do that. Okay, go home and I'm ranking 25. I better not show my parents my report card, right? But usually you have to be in a top. The focus, the family focus is making sure that you focus on education first before you do anything else. You're not distracted by all these activities and math and English. When I came here, I couldn't speak English at all, right? You put a math problem up there, and I'll be done within a few seconds, right? Because again, it's like what he was saying is practice. You doing math, and every night my dad would sit with me at home, and I was learning English a little bit, you know, even the writing and stuff, but focus on math problems and doing stuff like that every night. And we don't have a lot of distraction, and so because you're raised in that cultural environment, you're focused on education. There's no such thing as dropping out of high school. It's not a question of whether you go to college, you will go to college, right? And so it's a matter of, is the money there? Sometimes you don't have that money. You might have, if you don't make it to the public school, which is usually tested, then you have to get money to go to a private school. But if you do well and you're tested into the public school, then you can go for free. But I think it's the cultural thing where you're forced, not so much forced, but you are stressing, the parents are all stressing education. That's all you know. And so you really, you know, and up until this day, it never go away from me. Everything I approach is the same way. I'm pretty much, you know, once I start to do something, I commit to it, I finish it. Right? And that's one thing I think that he was saying is the student here who are the international student, they're very focused. I can tell these people, you know, that I have before, stop studying for your test, you study enough. They're not going to listen to me. They'll study until 2 minutes before the exam. And then there are students that are living here. When I say start studying, they would come to class the day before the test and haven't done much of anything. And it really is a different way of looking at things. If we can change the way we do things in this country a little bit, focus more on education, like he was saying, the family has to make sure that children are really committed to, you know, and that's a job not just for the school, but also for the parents. So we have to all work together to make sure our children are really focusing on, not on Facebook and all the social activity, you know, what's cool out there, what's on the cell phone, everybody's texting, but they're so completely distracted. They're not focused on what's important. And you gotta remember all this is gonna be behind you. You don't get education like he's saying. You're gonna fall behind and you're not gonna be able to get a good job with the way the economy is going right now. Education is really important. The higher up you go and the more competent you are. Don't just get a degree. Make sure you get the degree to be competent in what you do. Okay, so that's really important.
And I can add something about math here, a little plug for your American students. There's a high correlation between the number of math courses a student takes and the student's income. Not the future student, his income earning something in the future. How do you like that?
I might have to explain that a little bit. I didn't.
Okay, the more math courses you take, raises, generally speaking, in general, raises your salary.
Oh, okay.
Because what math does is it teaches you to think. Okay, analyze. So, that's how you use math.
Yeah.
Not just the software.
But yeah, on the whole, like education thing too, like with the parents, like with my parents being teachers, and my dad was a principal, that was like one of his biggest things, getting parents involved too, because that's like, it's also how you're raised. If your parents aren't involved, you're not gonna care about school. But if
Yeah,
your parents care about school, then you're gonna be like, oh, I need this. So I think that's where it like gets us to, is how well our parents are determined in school.
Yeah, this society has, you know, we got a lot of going on. So sometimes the parents have to work to provide for the family, so it's hard for them to do it. But somehow we have to find a way, because I think we're heading in the wrong direction. And as a teacher, I'm really concerned. I want people to do well. I just came out 4 hours of lab today, and you know, the math part, I mean, if you cannot multiply 20 times 100 without a calculator, and I have that kind of mistake, 20 times 100 is not 200. Okay, and that's what I've been getting. All right, and if you cannot do that at this level in college, then there is a serious problem. All right, and I'm seeing that trend, and it's affecting, like Linda Lee was saying, it's affecting not just, math, but you're seeing it in science, you're seeing it in every other area, and that critical thinking is very important, critical analysis. We see that in writing, the way they write, the way they think, the way they approach the job, the situation. It's going to affect you in every area, aspect of your life, so we got to do something to improve the school year, to make sure the students are getting, prepared, so that we can have a better economy, and maybe you got to stay. If everybody gets smarter, we'll all stay here. Instead of people getting it, and that's a problem. That what do they call it? This whole expression they're saying that the Chinese students are coming here and learning from us, but then they're taking the education instead of benefiting the U.S. and now going back to China. So that is sad because we were at one time they were coming here, they wanted to stay here, they want to build the United States, but now they're going back to China.
Well, because that country is growing faster
And it's
than,
growing faster
and the
than
opportunities there are much greater than they are here.
Right,
It's just natural human nature.
right.
What else? Anything else?
I have a question.
Yes.
So what do you think of the Chinese patent protection? Like we do things physically, we don't do things mentally. Like the book we buy here is way too much expensive, like $100, but the books in China like $5 or $6. It's quite cheap. People don't pay attention to these. I mean, like if we continue to grow the economy, like
Books are going to become more expensive.
no, no, it's like all the stuff we make, it's not like demand is infinite. We have to reach a point, we have to convert our economy into a new form, like more information technology.
Which is what's happening right now in the Chinese economy.
Because, my point is, right now Chinese people don't buy copyright software. Like,
Right. Well,
we don't pay music, we don't pay movie, that's a big problem.
it is a big problem.
So what do you think if China has reached a point and cannot go any further?
It will reach a point and not go further. I don't quite understand the question. Does somebody else understand the question?
Yeah, let me ask you
About
what
piracy.
China should do to develop the economic. If we are now we are in this situation, we are good, but we will try to find a way to like develop our economic
Yeah, like our
in the
education
future.
system, like our high-tech companies. So we can build chairs, we can build the chips.
Well, one of the points I was trying to make in my presentation is that that the Chinese government realizes that this transition is necessary. And that's the reason why these universities have been built in such great numbers, is to focus the country now on moving away from chair production into moving into higher technology. And the way to do that is simply by building human capital, by bringing academics to China and providing that kind of a technological transfer. In that way, China will make this leap from producing cheap manufactures to, in fact, producing high technology. They're doing exactly what they need to do right now. And as I said, in 10 years, or maybe a little bit longer, the Chinese economy will make that transition. Because, again, labor is pricing itself out of cheap manufacturers in China because of minimum wage laws now. So those industries are going to leave. And China is going to be forced to, just like in the United States, we have been forced to, focusing on other kinds of industries that we, in fact, do have a comparative advantage in. So China had a comparative advantage in cheap labor, but that's changing. And the way to deal with that is to put more people in university, which is exactly what the government is doing. Anything else? For those of you in my classes,
Announcement?
yeah, sorry.
Do you mind, Doctor?
No, go ahead. Welcome.
Probably tomorrow, you'll be getting an email from me, and I'm afraid it's not for you guys. It's for the American students here. One of our partner universities in China is offering our students complete financial package to study in their university for 3 to 6 months, which is just amazing. We would work with you to make sure we would get those courses to be able to go back towards your degree in some way, and to set the time for you to go. You'll get this, if you are interested at all, remotely interested, let me know, so I can start checking into it for your specific situation. Would that be incredible? That will also help you get a job, because it sets you apart when you apply for a job. There's plenty of people out there with BBAs and BSs and VAs and everything else, with the same grade point average and the same social activities that you have, but you'd be the one that studied in the rising economy and may be number 1 in the world shortly. And you will have that experience and it will pay off. So if you are interested, email me back when you get that email, okay?
And you know what, I encourage you to do that because one, you know, it's an opportunity to see something besides, you know, living in Georgia and United States, seeing another country. Another thing is that you were asking me how you would understand and interact with how they study. You know how they come here and they see us. If you go there and you work and you study with them, you would start to see why they're successful, and you probably will pick up some of that, and then you'll bring it back, and it will change you as a person in the way you look at them. It changes you quite a bit to see another culture. So I encourage it. I think that's a good idea.
It's an incredible opportunity.
Yeah.
They chose us to do that. We are very honored.
Good.
Great. Well, thank you, Phil. It was tremendous.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. For my students, I have sign-up sheets up here, macro and micro. So
Yeah, I got 2 legal pads circulating around.